as the director of the center, I must introduce today's resource person and speaker. Dr. Pradipta Mukherjee is a film critic, works at Department of English, Vidyasagar College for Women, University of Calcutta. Mukherjee completed UGC research project on Shakespearean cinema, and she has worked as the organizing secretary for the international conference which was held at OUCIP, and she has been a member of the Regional Film Selection Board, Prasar Bharati, Kendra, Government of India. Dr. Mukherjee has been a resource person in many national and international conferences. She published many books as a sole author and as a co-author. Mukherjee has presented her research on cinema at some of the most prestigious academic forums. She has good publications. She published many research articles in the prestigious national and international literary journals. Usually she writes on postmodern English novels, cinema, and arts in the columns of the Statesman, one of the most leading dailies in the country. When she visited OUCIP the last March, just before COVID's second wave, and our students and research scholars gave us the wonderful feedback on her lecture, so that immediately we consulted her to deliver the talk. Madam accepted to deliver the talk on postmodernism from meta fiction to meta cinema. Thank you, ma'am. Now may I invite Professor Pradipta Mukherjee to deliver the talk.
Thank you very much. Hello everyone. Good afternoon to all of you. I would like to begin my talk by thanking Osmania University Center for International Programs, Hyderabad, for inviting me to their virtual platform, and I would specifically like to thank Dr. Konda Nageshwara Rao, Director of OUCIP, for hosting me here today. Thank you, sir, for your very warm invitation, and it is indeed an honor and privilege to be here today on this digital platform of OUCIP. Thank you very much. The title of my presentation is From Metafiction to Metacinema, Postmodernism and John Fowles's 1967 novel, The French Lieutenant's Woman. I think right at the outset, I should tell you all what my talk intends to do today. Firstly, to resituate Fowles's fascinating classic in the postmodern map, then try and locate the basic tenets of postmodernism or postmodernity in Fowles's novel. Though the two terms, postmodernism and postmodernity, may not be that interchangeable. The second part of my talk shall discuss the novel into film adaptation, this very exciting and challenging process of transition from page to screen, or I would say transcreation from metafiction to metacinema. This talk shall try to be a bit interdisciplinary in scope by talking about not just the literary text or the cinematic text, that is the 1981 film adaptation of Fowles's novel by Harold Pinter and Carol Reyes, but also a few paintings to illustrate the cultural practices of modernism and postmodernism. Postmodernism, with its focus on styles and modes of representation, is often read as a successor to modernism. And by modernism, I mean those literary and cultural movements that emerged across Europe and North America during the second half of the 19th century and first half of the 20th century. Now, in that sense, there are modernisms in literature, art, music, theater, dance, architecture, or even photography. Say, for instance, we have this movement called Expressionism or Surrealism, which were born out of modernism. And perhaps the most well known Expressionist painter is Edvard Munch, and the most famous Surrealist painter was Salvador Dali. Now, here, let me digress a bit for the sake of clarity, and this digression will help me to get across my understanding of modernism and help me to convey to all of you what I understand by modernism. The German expressionist painter Edvard Munch did not want to depict the impression the world made on him in certain lights, like, say, Claude Monet, who was an impressionist painter. Munch wished to paint the way the world or situation made him feel. He wanted to portray emotions provoked by the world. He saw the world as a battleground between desire and social constraint. Unlike the Impressionists, Expressionist painters concentrated more on shadows than on light, on the sinister effects of shade and dark, the qualities of nightmare and alienation, in opposition to the celebration of incandescence and beauty found in the work of a painter such as Pierre Auguste Renoir. So I would like to show you a few paintings from Impressionism and Expressionism, because that will help me to, clarify my stance on modernism and postmodernism. Now, when the Impressionists showed the uniqueness of an object in the moment of time, the Expressionists did the same with the human subject. This is why they are considered modernists. I mean, the Expressionist painters are considered modernists and the Impressionists are not. Because painters like Edvard Munch projected an alienated self onto the environment, painting the way reality felt. It was an intense, realistic experience, not the way it looked. I'm talking about these paintings at the very beginning because I did not wish to restrict my talk to modernism in literature only, but how modernism and postmodernism embraced other art forms, particularly in Europe. Yes, this is a painting by the Impressionist painter Claude Monet. He paints a lady holding an umbrella in the summer season. So that's a stark, realistic Impressionist painting by Claude Monet. Yes, this is another painting by Claude Monet, and this is in Giverny. This is in Paris, very close to Paris, where Monet's own house is in Giverny. I was fortunate enough to visit Claude Monet's house in Giverny, and trust me, the place Giverny looks exactly the same. The pristine beauty of the place has been still restored. Okay, so this painting is something again which is a very important Impressionist painting I wanted to share with all of you, and it is titled Bridge Over a Pond of Water Lilies. Bridge Over a Pond of Water Lilies. So these two paintings are by the Impressionist painter Claude Monet, and I wouldn't call them modernist paintings. We now move on to the third painting by Pierre Auguste Renoir. Yes, this is a painting by the famous, celebrated Impressionist painter, Pierre Auguste Renoir. But still, I wouldn't call this painting a modernist painting. So this is by Renoir, a painting, a portrait of a young girl. The next painting is very important to show the transition from Impressionism to Expressionism. This is a painting by Edvard Munch, the Expressionist painter, and this is a modernist painting. And the next painting, please, by Edvard Munch again. This is Death and the Child, because the child for the first time has encountered death, and this is the reaction. It is holding both its ears, clasping its ears, and the traumatic child is, absolutely left nowhere by the death it has just encountered. So it is titled Death and the Child. Now, these two paintings, Samuel, can we go back to the previous painting once again, please? Yes, thank you so much. Now, this painting by Edvard Munch, which I call a modernist painting, is titled The Scream in 1893, and it paints a tumultuous picture of dystopian reality. Now, wasn't that a chaotic emotional state that Munch had given expression to? In the painting, if you look at this painting, The Scream, a person whose gender remains unspecified is clasping its face and screaming in anguish alone on a dock. The painting crystallizes an uncharacteristic moment of panic, trauma, disorder, and mental illness, and a rather modernist rendition of the traumatic self. Yes, so that is why I discussed the paintings, because the paintings, the expressionist painters, the surrealist painters, they were giving expression to a rather modernist, it was a kind of a modernist rendition of the traumatic self. So, the successor of modernism is postmodernism. And I'm going to talk about postmodernism today, but we cannot talk about postmodernism in isolation. Postmodernism has to be discussed in relation to modernism. So I consider the successor of modernism to be postmodernism, and postmodernism is a rather elastic and nomadic term, because postmodernism has again ranged across the arts and culture. Like modernism, it appears in a variety of disciplines, and the dominant socio-cultural trends or the prevailing sensibility of the contemporary consumer-driven society may be viewed as postmodern. Then the question is whether postmodern is a radical break from the past. But postmodernism, I would say, emerged as a reaction to modernism. And though postmodernism seeks to supersede the theories of modernism, it actually interacts with those theories of modernism. And we have different versions of postmodernism emerging from modernism. Now, it is interesting that this prefix post of postmodernism, or I would say this prefix post of this particular ism, has a kind of chameleon quality. It enables it to interpolate or interrogate everything. Despite the variability inherent in the term, the post prefix of postmodernism has a tendency to destabilize or render ambiguous, since it always claims to gesture beyond or behind or away from the core word. Now, in this case, if the core word is modern, it gestures beyond or away from the core word. Thus, it never allows the core word to control the ultimate meaning. It is essential to understand this nature of destabilization. So, in this talk, I will now try to resituate John Fowles's novel in this postmodern map and see how it uses techniques and strategies attributable to the postmodernist movement, and yet it is in many ways not a postmodern novel at all. Now, this basic paradox is at the heart of postmodernism. Now, let me begin with the term postmodernism. It is a rather complicated term, a set of ideas, I would say, one that has already emerged as an area of academic study since the mid 1960s and 1970s and 1980s. It is hard to locate postmodernism. It is hard to locate postmodernism temporally and historically, because it is not clear when modernism ends and postmodernism begins. We cannot pinpoint when modernism ends. When exactly does postmodernism begin? Now, if we look at postmodernism as a movement, as a philosophical, literary, and cultural movement in literature and arts, then an all-encompassing definition of the movement is nowhere to be found, because it doesn't hinge itself upon one particular theory. So, as I said, it is a set of ideas, and we can try and look at the cultural theories of postmodernism and try and relate them to contemporary cultural practices. Now, when this novel by John Fowles, The French Lieutenant's Woman, was published in 1969, it was immediately identified as a highly experimental, innovative, and structurally complex work. The paradox is readers could read it as a serious piece of historical fiction. They could read it as an existential manifesto, as some kind of postmodern parody, as metafiction, or they could read it just as popular entertainment. Now, why should we then consider Fowles's novel as postmodern? One needs to review if the term postmodernist does at all make any sense. Is not the term postmodernist very conceited? For if modern means pertaining to the present, then postmodern can only mean pertaining to the future. And in that case, what could postmodernist fiction be except fiction that has not yet been written? So we need to identify what in postmodernism is actually post. Post here is not something which comes after the present, but something which comes after the modernist movement. So there is a poetics inherent in the term postmodernism, a poetics which indicates, a poetics which gives us a direction. It is the successor of modernism, or possibly a reaction to modernism, but not exactly a resistance to modernism, and not some hypothetical writing of the future. So the post in postmodernism is Janus-faced, the Greek god Janus. It is double-faced. The post in postmodernism is double-faced, I would say, because it is both change and the precondition of change. So in French philosopher Lyotard's influential work, The Postmodern Condition, where postmodernism is defined as an incredulity towards meta-narratives, there is a perception of a recursive relationship between modernism and postmodernism. A work can become modern only if it is first postmodern. Postmodernism, like modernism, follows most of the same ideas, rejecting boundaries between high and low forms of art, rejecting rigid genre distinctions, emphasizing pastiche, parody, bricolage, irony, playfulness, and postmodern art and thought favors flexibility, reflexivity, and self-consciousness, fragmentation, and discontinuity. Now, by discontinuity here, I mean discontinuity in narrative structures, ambiguity, simultaneity. So the presence of these factors in The French Lieutenant's Woman have led critics to read Fowles's text as a brilliant postmodern text. But it can also be called a text which exists in some kind of a transitory phase between modernism and postmodernism. The novel is set largely in Lime Reggae in 1860s. To be very precise, it is set in 1867 and it recreates a Victorian romance. Yes, it's a 20th century novel which is recreating a Victorian romance, and it reminds us of the world of George Eliot and Thomas Hardy. Now, in Fowles's Victorian story, a wealthy amateur paleontologist, the hero, Charles Smithson, falls in love with Sarah Woodruff, a passionate Victorian governess who people believe has been deserted by a French naval lieutenant. The affair has ostracized Sarah from society. However, like her creator, the novelist John Fowles, Sarah turns out to be an arch manipulator herself, whose story is an almost complete fabrication. Perhaps the French lieutenant never existed. Throughout the novel, Sarah flaunts her supposed sexual immorality, thereby freeing herself from the demands of Victorianism. That is, once she chooses to blatantly defy society, she no longer has to concern herself with its approval. Sarah's scandalous choice in favor of freedom gives her the opportunity to pursue a do your own thing kind of lifestyle. Now, this lifestyle, however, forces Sarah to undertake a journey of isolation and seclusion from Victorian society. Now, Fowles's primary existential concern, is freedom, is personified in the character of Sarah. Right from the beginning, she emerges as an epitome of freedom. So the trope of the fallen woman, someone who is an outcast, not accepted in society, someone who has chosen sexual transgression by will, all this come into play in the very first scene of the movie. And I'm going to show you the film clip where the trope of the fallen woman comes into play along with other tropes through which society perceives Sarah. Because in this clip, you will see there are three characters. Charles is engaged to Ernestina. So he is walking by the seaside with Ernestina, his fiancée, to whom he's engaged and to whom he is supposed to be married within a couple of months from now. And then suddenly at a distance, he perceives Sarah. And immediately, he is drawn towards this enigmatic, character, Sarah. So, and you will also see that Ernestina tries to prevent Charles from, moving towards Sarah, because that is the conventional way how society perceives Sarah. She tells Sarah is known as tragedy. She's the French lieutenant's whore. She's the French lieutenant's woman. So better leave her alone. Better not go and talk to her, those kinds of things. So I'll show that clip because it brings into play that trope of the fallen woman in Victorian society. And also I will show you the clip for several other reasons. And that one scene is so interesting because it brings in so many kinds of cultural debates into existence. And in the novel, you will see that Fowles's refusal as a narrator to enter Sarah's mind has been a matter of debate. Some feminist critics suggest that Sarah is a feminist heroine because she is pictured as evolving to some kind of feminist consciousness, and she evolves into a kind of new woman by the end of the novel. Others maintain that the novel is anti-feminist because Fowles's refusal to enter her mind makes her an object of male desire rather than a fully rounded, intelligent female character. So the film adaptation visualizes Sarah, here played by Meryl Streep, in the Victorian tale as an outsider, an outcast, a beautiful and seductive woman who charms her lover Charles, leading him to a kind of a compromising situation. And he calls off his engagement with Ernestina. He rejects Ernestina for Sarah. And that is how the love triangle between Charles, Ernestina, and Sarah develop in the novel. Now, in French, they call such kind of women femme fatale, a figure of enigma and mystery. And such women have displayed a flickering interest in men for money, power, and sex. So the powerful femme fatale, the lethal woman, was emerging in the 1940s in modern cinema, particularly in the modern film noir genre. She was a rather strong modernist representation of woman because of her seductive power over the hero. So now can we have the first film?
Shall we return? The wind is getting very strong.
I should have thought you might welcome a reason to hold my hand without impropriety.
Very well. Good Lord. What on earth is she doing?
Oh, it's poor tragedy.
Tragedy?
Bushmen have a grosser name for her.
What?
They call her the French lieutenant's.
Do they?
Please come.
I must speak to her. She could fall.
She won't thank you. She's mad.
It's dangerous. Will you stay there?
Charles! Charles!
Madam! Madam! Madam, forgive me. I'm alarmed for your safety. Come back! Madam!
What I was trying to say is, this figure of the femme fatale, which is a figure of enigma and mystery, and this woman was who displayed a kind of interest in men for maybe money, power, recognition, and all that. So this lethal female figure was emerging in the 1940s in modern cinema, particularly in the modern film noir genre, and she was a rather strong, palpable modernist presence on screen because of her seductive power over the hero. So these are the reasons I showed you that clip. But I'm trying to say is that Meryl Streep, who plays the role of Sarah in this film, is, you have Meryl Streep's seductive Sarah, which is given a far greater and more modern independence than the confining age would normally allow. Thus, in the novel, which is characterized by multiple endings, such a metafiction that Fowles has composed and its metacinematic rendition leave Sarah indeterminate. Now, indeterminate is again a term, a very heavily loaded term I'm borrowing from postmodernism. So, this kind of a metacinematic rendition leaves Sarah indeterminate, free to emerge as she wishes from the end of the film. And the scene does give us a sneak peek of the enigmatic Sarah with whom the hero falls in love with, and he breaks off his engagement with Ernestina. And you saw how the ocean is foregrounded in that scene. The ocean is roaring and raging in the foreground, and the ocean represents life's unfathomed depths, its flux and hidden complexities. Now, I'm talking about a very highly self-conscious artist, John Fowles. And as a highly self-conscious artist, Fowles fully registers the artifice inherent in the act of writing by foregrounding the fictiveness of fiction itself. He writes a fiction which highlights the fictionality of fiction. With its vivid pastiche of Victorian fiction and famous device of alternative endings, The French Lieutenant's Woman ends thrice, not once, but it ends thrice. The French Lieutenant's Woman remains his best known novel. I must mention the unusual construction of the three endings in the novel. In the third ending, that is the final ending in chapter 61, which is absolutely open ended, Fowles gives the protagonists existential freedom. It imitates the open, existentially free endings of canonical modernist novels. Such open-endedness undermines authority in the narrative. It highlights the incompleteness of texts. It highlights the permutation of texts and the deferment of meanings. It permits the text to display its postmodernist rejection of Victorian closure. However, with the choice of multiple endings, the novel shows how neither conclusion is inevitable. The multiple endings allow postmodernist indeterminacy and juxtaposes Victorian closure with modernist openness. The dual ending in chapter 60 and chapter 61 is a reminder that the world of the mid-20th century is too complex to admit of conventional formulaic endings. Now, it is not easy to determine which elements of the plot, dialogue, and style are wholly modern or Victorian. It is difficult to declare that The French Lieutenant's Woman is simply 20th century or a simply 20th century postmodern novel, because it is partly Victorian. The narrator is being self-consciously avant-garde by breaking some of the 20th century conventions of the novel. For instance, by imitating Victorian idioms and also at the same time inserting self-reflexive passages. And he also makes it evident that his text is too close to the 19th century ancestors. He is too close to the 19th century ancestors to be neatly separated from them. So what Fowles does is, he has tried to reconstruct and then deconstruct a Victorian novel. And interestingly enough, Fowles's novel is not the novel of any Victorian novelist, because not the novel of any Victorian novelist like, say, Dickens, the Bronte sisters, the Thackeray, Trollope, George Eliot, or Thomas Hardy, because Fowles is reconstructing and then deconstructing his own recreation of the Victorian novel and acknowledging perhaps that no contemporary writer could or should write as the Victorians did. And therein lies the irony. Now, in postmodern novels, a reverse move is detectable. Narration itself became a theme within the novel. Writers felt it necessary to write about writing, to tell about the telling of stories, because the whole possibility of fiction had been thrown into question. This is something very postmodern. Fiction became metafiction, stories about stories, fiction about fiction, novel within novels, and therefore the existence of Chinese box structures in postmodern novels. Postmodernist features are typically organized, I would say, in terms of oppositions with features of modernist poetics. David Lodge has singled out 5 techniques typical of postmodernist fiction, like contradiction, discontinuity, randomness, excess, and short circuit. Although he notes that these indicate only some of the possibilities. One of Lodge's techniques, which chiefly applies to the French lieutenant's woman, is discontinuity. Attention may be drawn to the confrontation of the two epochs and the narrator's metafictional asides. Lodge argues postmodernism is suspicious of continuity, and fouls like Samuel Beckett, another playwright, a very experimental avant-garde playwright of the modern period. So fouls like Samuel Beckett disrupts the continuity of his discourse by unpredictable swerves of tone and metafictional asides to the reader. Now, critics have described Fowles's work, as I already said, have described Fowles's work as metafiction and historiographic metafiction. Metafiction is fiction which is built into it a moment of self-reflection, or which alludes to its own fictional practice. Metafiction is a work of fiction that is intensely aware of its own fictionality and forces its readers to notice this phenomenon while experiencing the narrative itself. Metafictional works are those which explore a theory of writing fiction through the practice of writing fiction. One of its consistent features is its ironic self-referentiality. And historiographic metafictions are novels that are intensely self-reflexive, but that also both reintroduce historical context into metafiction and problematize the entire question of historical knowledge. The omniscient, all-knowing, intrusive narrator personifies many of the novel's contradictions in Fowles's The French Lieutenant's Woman. He usually comments on the action from outside, but twice enters the story. Fowles employs a playful and probing narrative technique when he addresses the reader directly. He appears in a number of guises, as the narrator novelist, as the overdressed impresario who enters the train carriage with his hero and turns back his watch. And thus he's turning back narrative time to permit the dual ending. And as the disembodied narrator who observes this going on. It is interesting to observe the way Fowles plays with the concepts of authorship and readership and their respective roles in the formation of the narrative. All this is at the heart of postmodernism. So this is what I would say postmodern film appropriations of, say, William Shakespeare were also doing in the new millennium. New Shakespeare films, or I would say postmodern Shakespeare films, problematized terms like originality and authorship, which are the subject to change, and they dwell on this complex and hybrid nature of adaptation. Even Fowles's film, it foregrounds the complex and hybrid nature of adaptation. Now, with its multiple endings, I would say The French Lieutenant's Woman remains a novel of forking paths. His multiple endings is an instance of forking path postmodernism. It was rather difficult and perplexing when Harold Pinter and Carol Reyes decided to film the novel. The question was, how should one go about it? The fact that this fiction was written from both a mid-Victorian and modern viewpoint further complicated matters. Traditionally, film has supplied narratorial commentary by using voiceover, but in this case, Carol Reyes and Harold Pinter achieve a similar effect by using more cinematic devices in their 1981 film adaptation. A major problem was how to represent chapter 13 and the novel's 3 endings on screen. After much discussion, Fowles agreed that the best solution would be to introduce a second story into the film, the story of the actors playing Charles and Sarah. The second story makes the film metafictional, or more acutely, metacinematic, in that the actors, Mike and Anna, discuss the parts they play in the filming of the French Lieutenant's Woman and thereby disrupt the illusion that the action is set in 1867 actually happened in the past. The film about Mike and Anna is in turn metacinematic, for we are aware that these two are actually actors, Jeremy Irons and Meryl Streep. So that is how it becomes metacinematic. And the second clip, I hope this is going to work better than the first one, is an example of this forking path postmodernism. Because if Fowles's metafiction was a kind of retrospective 20th century examination of the Victorian novel, then the metacinema is a 20th century perspective of Victorian romance. In this clip, modern day actors Mike and Anna, they are rehearsing their roles as Charles and Sarah. And while they are rehearsing their roles, they are reading from the script. Now, the script is foregrounded in this scene because the two actors, modern day actors, Mike and Anna, they are reading from the script. And the script of Harold Pinter is immensely important because it acts as a bridge. The screenplay of Harold Pinter acts as a bridge between the written text and the cinematic text. So what you have here is the two actors rehearsing their roles as Victorian characters, and the transition from the modern to the Victorian world, okay, happens through a match cut. We call it in film language match cut, and the film within the film frame making happens through this match cut in the film. So can we have...
I suddenly see you. You've got your dress caught in the brambles. I see you. Then you see me. We look at each other, and then I say, Miss Woodruff.
All right.
Right. I see you. Get your coat caught in the brambles. Right. Now I'm looking at you. You see me. Miss Woodruff.
I'm looking at you.
But now you come towards me to pass me. It's a narrow path and it's muddy. You slip in the mud. And I help you out.
Let's just do it again, okay?
All right.
Let's just do it again. All right. I've got my dress caught in the brambles. Suddenly you see me. I see you.
Miss Woodruff.
I dread to think, Miss Woodruff, what would happen if you should one day turn your ankle in a place like this.
I must go back.
Permit me to say something to you first. I know I am a stranger to you, but
this was an example of forking path postmodernism, because if Fowles's metafiction was a kind of a retrospective 20th century examination of the Victorian novel, then this metacinema is a kind of 20th century perspective on Victorian romance, and it was done through a match cut. The modern day actors becoming Victorian actors, going back to the Victorian age as Victorian actors, that was done through a match cut, and it was actually trying to illustrate this example of forking path postmodernism. So such a metafilmic rendition of a novel on screen is almost exemplary of the fidelity of transformation. The most spectacular achievement of the film is the fact that using purely cinematic techniques like the framing modern story, and you just got to see a bit of it, the framing modern story, and intertwining them with the Victorian romance, Carol Reyes and Harold Pinter managed to recreate the distance between the audience and the Victorian story that Fowles achieved by using the intrusive narrator in the book within the book. So if in the novel the reader is at once removed from the story because it is a pastiche, like parody, it borrows ideas or stylistic devices from other works, and that is what makes it heavily intertextual. Then in Race's adaptation, the audience is placed in a similar position by being constantly reminded that this is a film acted out by a cast of people. Thus, we are made aware of this wonderful instance of fidelity of transition, where a metacinematic rendition considerably alters the metafictional aspects of the text in order to retain its quote-unquote spirit, the spirit of the original. So we as viewers, we must be aware of what film cannot do, what literature can do, about the difference in the structure and effects of the two media. Thus, in assessing this kind of film adaptation, we are never really comparing Fowles's book with Race's film, but we are simultaneously looking at a work of creation with an act of interpretation. By interpretation, I mean both the screenplay and the film. And the screenplay, as I said, acts as a bridge between the literary text and the film text. But just as we are readers, so implicitly is the screenplay writer and the filmmaker through their works, offering us their perceptions, their vision, their particular insight into Fowles's source material, that is the novel. Let me conclude now. I think we are closing in on time. So I would conclude by drawing attention to this actual reception of modernism. This is what Linda Hutcheon quotes in Poetics of Postmodernism, that postmodernism is sociologically limited to mostly academic readers interested in complicated texts. That is a lot of humor in that quotation. You see, this is not what she says. She is quoting from another postmodern critic. And I'll repeat the quotation because it is so full of, tongue-in-cheek humor. She says that postmodernism is sociologically limited to mostly academic readers interested in complicated texts. But if that is true, Linda Hutcheon argues, how do we account for the fact that the French Lieutenant's Woman and so many other historiographic metafictions have been prominent on the bestsellers list in both Europe and North America? One of the contradictions of postmodernism is that it does indeed close the gap that Leslie Fiedler saw between high and low art forms. And it does so through the ironizing of both. Postmodernism is both academic and popular, elitist and accessible. And one of the greatest successes of postmodernism, I think, is the way in which it has made art accessible to the general masses, the way it has led to the democratization of art. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pratibha Madam. Almost you have covered every aspect of modernism and postmodernism and in a lucid manner. Such a theoretical and conceptualized understanding was made very easy by your presentation. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Vanendra. Thank you, my technical team from OUCIP, scholars, Department of English, and teachers from different parts of the country. And thank you all. And we will meet next Tuesday with another talk. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you once again. Thank you all.